Minute or two about what we do here at Podcast Radio, who I'm representing today, where we came up with the idea. It sounds almost too obvious, I know. And then I'm going to run through some slides, so it shouldn't make a difference about which way my camera points on the other ones. I will be introducing our other speakers. I've been talking to them outside of today's event, and really, really interesting stuff too, from lots of different angles. So please, if you've got any questions, pop it in the Q&A session. We'd love to talk to you, and we'd love to engage, because sometimes, obvious questions are the ones that you should ask. There is no too simple a question. Okay, so my name's Gerry Edwards. I'm the founder and CEO of something called Podcast Radio. You've probably guessed, it's podcasts on the radio, but it's more of a platform for discovering new content. We have radio channels, but we've supported it with website, app, discovery bios for every podcast. And stick with me here for a second while I'll throw some ideas at you. A few years back, I was a podcaster in the UK, and the way it worked, we went into the top 10 of UK comedy podcasts, my co-host and I, but I was also the manager, and I designed a radio station in London. So I had all the facility, all the microphones, all the studio, all the editing tools at my disposal. And the podcast was pretty good. It went to the top 10, as I say, but only for a week. And then it pretty much disappeared, which was frustrating. What it meant is that I had noticed very early on that there is a very big marketing problem with podcasting, because it's easy to create and produce a podcast and upload a podcast to the internet. That does mean there is an oversaturation of content. We all know it. It's something that, people don't want to talk about in podcasting. There's so many podcasts. Where do you start? Similar to Netflix. You open Netflix, you look for a program for so long, people give up. And of course, at the same time with podcasting, some people don't know where to get a podcast. They don't know what a podcast is. So we thought, with the marketing problem and the relatively new industry that is podcasting, we thought there was now time for a podcast platform using radio, putting it out into mass media so that whatever podcast was being broadcast, it was being listened by a lot of people. And I'm just going to run you through some of the visuals of the platform. Give me a shout if you can't see this, guys. Hopefully it's giving the slides. Podcast radio. So we say we're discover the world's best podcast. We are pretty confident in saying that slogan. We didn't say it when we first launched 2 years ago, because we've made some partnerships with some amazing podcast creators, including TED Talks, Curious Cast in Canada. We've got an American network on board. Now, these are big networks with, at times thousands of episodes from hundreds of different titles. So we really do have some of the best podcasts on the planet across our channels. And it is, of course, linear, like radio. It's into the airwaves, being consumed en masse by a lot of people. Don't worry, I won't read this word for word. What we do, we're the first ever platform for discovering and promoting podcasts through digital broadcasting. Basically, we've got a radio format. We have your news bulletins, a presenter, and then, of course, we play a podcast. Why we're the best? Well, we think we are tackling the problem of podcast discoverability. You put your podcast out there, how does it get found? Now, we're not the only solution to this. Of course, we're not, but we are a pretty strong bit of a platform that solves this problem. We use mass media, the broadcasting. We partner with people, independent or networks. We've got our app, our website. We are available on smart speakers right around the world. And the opportunity in podcasting, we know, as James will have just said in our opening speech of the event, it's just huge. Just look at what Apple, Amazon, and Spotify are buying, and why potentially they're buying things. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry right now because of the acquisitions. So we want to be the podcast playground. Once again, you can flick on the radio in the UK and you can listen to podcast radio, and there is a podcast playing. The idea is, of course, lots of people are hearing it at the same time. Where sometimes it's celebrities, or sometimes it's influencers, or sometimes it's just someone you've never heard of. We give them all the same value. And so we want to be this middle area where people, whether they know much about podcasting or not, can come and hear brand new content. So we call ourselves a discovery tool. racing through it. We've made our partnerships. We've got a whole host of people who are coming in to listen. And we've got 120 plus countries tuning in around about each week. I think we're 126 as of last week. We are expanding to more cities. We are going into new countries. And most importantly, although it's all in English, sorry about this, speaking at the Arabic PodCon, I know, but although it's all in English right now, we do have international expansion and potentially language changing. But right now, we are focusing on Australia and America. And again, the power in the numbers, the more people who listen to podcast radio and hear your podcast on it, the stronger it will be for, well, getting more people to go and give you downloads, hear your ads. We are sharing listeners from podcast radio across whoever our partners are that week being featured. We crowdfunded a bit of cash last year. That was so we could market and expand, and we are doing so at the moment. And towards the right of the screen, we're just highlighting it's into the millions nowadays of listeners in the English-speaking countries, some of the big markets. Spotify, of course, has over 2.2 million podcasts, as they've announced recently. Some of the key features of our platform. Yes, it has radio channels, but it's more than that, we believe. That means we connect online, offline, importantly, which is rare nowadays, and we have broadcast engagement. So we kind of hit a three-way, a trifecta there, of getting people to talk, read, consume, and most importantly, hear new podcasts using our platforms. It's high quality. We only partner with stuff that sounds pretty good. It's curated programming, and I want to focus on that word curation. Podcasting is struggling because Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon, and Google now, they want you to come to their platform and they want you to pick your own podcast, or they might have a ranking that week, or they might have new and noteworthy podcasts. But really, you have to do all the work, don't you? You have to figure it out. And a few years ago, when I was working in radio, they had a problem with iPods. Everyone thought radio was dead. Everyone always thinks radio is dead until that product stops being as strong as radio. And it was the iPods once. You could have 2,000 songs in your pocket and you could choose them. Amazing. However, people stopped liking their own music. They stopped liking being a DJ. They found it a bit of a chore, and they had to do this ugly word. They had to curate their own listening experience. Now, it's happening with podcasting. If you're not right smack in the middle of a good series, do you really want to go and, before you drive somewhere, find a new series, put it on, drive 5 minutes, you didn't like it, pull over, change? That is the risk of curating your own content. Now, we of course, curate our podcast radio. We're working on some tech where you could tell us whether you like comedy or science or sports, and we'll give you a bit more of a tailored listen. But right now, we've got the mass media, and we make sure the quality is there with all of the content. With our product, of course, unlimited expansion online, just like all of podcasting. If you host it right, 1 billion people could listen to your episode, if only. And monetization grows with people as they get discovered on our platform. And of course, on our website and our app, we're not precious. We say, if you as a consumer, so forget the podcaster for a minute, if the listener of podcast radio, if the 150,000 who listened last 90 days, who came along to the product, listened, if they wanted to listen on their own platform, their favorite, then they can. They can find your podcast on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Podbean, Google, wherever you've given us as a podcaster, wherever we can connect them to your podcast for the full series after they've heard a couple of episodes on podcast radio, we do so. It's a bit like, to say the obvious thing, it's a bit like putting out a single, if I can say that, in music. So an artist puts out a single and they hope you go and buy the album. That's what we're doing with podcast radio and podcasts. So the audio X factor, why is audio so strong? Well, our platform connects a listener and a podcaster. And there aren't many places that do that. In fact, I would challenge people to say, where do listeners find their new podcasts without scrolling and reading? Where do they go and discover and hear a podcast in its actual form of audio? And that's really what we build podcast radio for, because the only way to tell if you're going to like a podcast is actually listening to it. There was a market need, we believe. Every single podcast on this planet, Arabic, English, any other language, it wants more listeners. It wants more downloads. The producers need that to happen. There is a market need. Now, we are English language, of course, so we're saying UK, USA, and Australian podcast markets are booming. The promotional tools are lacking. And of course, as the Arabic world produces more podcasts, the same problem will happen. An oversaturation of podcasts coming out, although that's great and choice is great, it does mean it's difficult to find one that suits you. We are the world's only platform called Podcast Radio. We're the only platform 24/7 that does what we do. Now, this is a little bit confidential. I am currently speaking to you from Australia, where we're having meetings about launching Podcast Radio Australia. Keep that under your hat. We are launching Podcast Radio America using very different models, but the same idea. Get mass media to podcasts. And of course, we're capitalizing. We've got our own ad tech inside of our platforms because we've got to pay the bills. We are free, though, for independent podcasters. If your podcast's good, you want to be featured, we're free. And while we build some technology behind that, we are making sure it stays free for podcasters all the time. You can listen on the radio. That's the important thing. We are available on TuneIn, just like a radio station. But then we start being available on things like Deezer, where you could argue, are we radio or are we something else? We have license in the UK, which puts us on Radio Player, but then we're on Alexa, smart speakers, and we have our own app. We, of course, connect back to podcast, Acast, Audio Boom as platforms, but Spotify and iTunes where we can send listeners. And the important thing is our partners are getting bigger, better, stronger. The content is fantastic. It always has been, to be honest, because people can make great programs from their kitchen so long as it sounds good. And if you just look at TED Talks, 420 million annual downloads, it is amazing. There we have it. When I talk about international roadmaps, those two words stick out, America, Australia. We are currently broadcasting in the UK, but we do get a lot of listeners from America and Australia. Soon we'll be on their airwaves, giving them a product that is probably more suited to them. Of course, with that comes 3 channels people could choose, UK, Australia, America, and we'll be backing that up with podcast radio, drama, comedy, education, true crime, sport. So lots to come from us. And just a little bit of a highlights package from us here. Podcast radio is professionally programmed by people who, well, I'm happy to say, and I hope it's true, know what they're talking about with audio. We know what we're listening for when people apply. We know why we're playing certain programs. And we are multi-platform too. This is an important thing, of course. I know I keep harping on about it. When someone listens to podcast radio on the radio, sometimes on the dial, it will say the podcast that airs. And we put the actual logo of the podcast up. When that podcast is on podcast radio, it's all about them. Here's just a handful of examples. We have launched some of our own originals. Here's a TED podcast. Here's a celebrity podcast from the US of A. Lots of Hollywood stars on Alan Alda's Clear and Vivid. The James Bond A to Z podcast is in there too. And if I could, we make our own podcasts. We are across plenty of platforms. We do have the data that tells us people come, and when they click on, sure, some people might click for 2 or 3 minutes to see what podcast radio is all about. But our real life, genuine listeners, the ones who are coming back multiple times, 7, 8, 9 times a month, they're listening on average for 42 minutes plus. In fact, today was 46, the average. And we think that's important because they're hearing not just one, but perhaps 2 or 3 podcasts in that listen. They'll hear a news bulletin for 2 minutes. They'll hear a presenter say why we love the podcast. And then they will hear the actual podcast, an episode of somebody's podcast. And right in that moment, there is only one podcast that matters, and it is the one that is being featured, just like music radio did for years. And just a bit more about us, in case you're curious. We went and stole Gene Baxter. He is a radio presenter from something called K-Rock in the USA. He moved back to London, and with that came a nice little roll of podcast radio. He is a US Radio Hall of Famer. He's called The Bean. Kavita is our Asian Media Awards presenter of the year last year, or perhaps the year before with coronavirus. I'm not sure they had the event. We've got ex-BBC media consultant Paul Chantler in our launch team. And we've got someone who believes in the product, Jeff, who came in right at the start with media, tech, and telecoms background. And he was one of us who helped us get off the ground. Because we're going to America and Australia, we are going to be doing a raise soon. So if that interests anyone who wants to be part of it, please get in touch with me directly. And of course, we do sell things. We make programs. We produce them. We've got an in-house production team. We've got the platform and ads that we put on it. But we don't want it to ever to sound like full of ads. I would argue you'll hear more ads on Spotify or Apple now listening to podcasts than you would hear in an hour of podcast radio. And of course, normal radio, there is the argument it was full of ads once upon a time. But let's be honest, podcasting has kind of gone that way. And we did get we've had a Forbes article about us. We've had people write about us because we think we're interesting. We're doing something that no one else in the world is doing. But here's a good quote, we believe, from the Sunday Times, a huge newspaper in the UK. Podcast radio has found its place on the dial because of its investors' belief that with millions of podcasts to choose from, people would trust radio to discern one's worth hearing. Those words at the end, discern one's worth hearing, that is the challenge of every single podcast in the world. Why is yours worth listening to? How do you get it heard? I'll just have to be the voice of doom, talking from nowhere, everyone. Sorry about that. Hosting in the corner. That's it about podcast radio. If anyone has any questions, I know it's unusual. Feel free to fire them at me. I think I've had my 15 minutes of talking time. Okay, that's probably it from me.